the account here, something about my first voting that I did after I came to Florida. As I have occupied myself in the late 50s in writing articles about my early experiences, and that they were accepted by the Tampa Daily Tribune and published on the Pioneer Florida page of the Sunday editions of the Tampa Tribune. I find that I have written something about this first old schoolhouse that had to do with the balloting at that place. And it was printed under the heading that was given it in the paper of ballot boxes got rearranged. The heading of the article by the paper itself goes as follows. W.H. Sanders of Inverness, who was a pioneer settler on the lower east coast, has an interesting stories of memories of bizarre incidents and experiences in that area before Henry M. Flagler invaded it with his railroad and built the great tourist hotels, reclaimed swamps, and created great tourist resorts. Pioneer politics. Quotation of my article. One of my earliest memorable experiences when I first came to the Lake Worth area of Florida was when I qualified as a voter and went to the polls to cast my first ballot as a Floridian. All my previous experience in voting was what I had seen and known of in the way it was done in my native state, Kansas. The requirement of being registered and paying a poll tax was there unknown. If you could prove you were 21 years old or more, that was all the requirement, the voting, all the requirement. The voting was very simple. You asked for the Democratic ballot or the Republican, as you desired. No crosses were required. There was no Australian type of ballot. You folded your ballot and put it in the one box, and you had done your full duty as a voter. When I stepped into that first schoolhouse and faced the election board, I was asked to show my poll tax receipt and given my choice of a separate slip of paper for each office being voted for, either Democrat or Republican, and then faced a battery of boxes with the names of the office being voted for posted on the front of the box. It was my duty to put the right slip of paper in the right box, or I lost that vote for that officer. Really, I needed to be able to find the right man for governor or any other office and see that the ballot with the proper name was put in the proper box. I learned afterward that that was the way the Negro vote was practically eliminated. I saw, in fact, a so-called black Republican putting these slips of paper in the hands of a Negro between his fingers in the order in which he should put them in the boxes when he went in to vote. The black Republican had just voted and was sure of the rotation of the boxes and was listing the Republican ballots for the Negro as he thought they would fall in the right box. Meanwhile, the election board had, unintentionally of course, misplaced the head box, and when it was rearranged, it some way was at the other end of the row. There were a whole list of votes, but the Negro put in the wrong boxes, and these votes were as though they had never been cast. I asked Mr. Lienhardt, this had nothing to do. It does have a little bit to do with that George Lienhardt business that I was talking about. I asked Mr. Lanehart how much longer he worked on that job, and he owned up that as soon as another ship could be found that would take him back to New York, he asked for his time and left. During the years I knew him, he would frequently go back into the flat woods west of Lake Worth and bring home a deer, which he shared with his neighbors. After the railroad came, we had a murderous villain by the name of Sam Lewis, who caused the only lynching in the early days of old Dade County. That is a story that almost hitches up with the disappearance of Judge Chillingworth and has already been told in two other versions. Finishing out what it had to do with that voting business, when one looks at it calmly, it was no worse than the same ignorant voter trying to remember by counting just which names to put the X mark against on our present type of ballot. I think the Australian ballot was the law after the second general election that I voted in Florida. I do not want to deny any voter the right to vote, but I do think we do not need ignoramuses to be helped to vote when it is their own fault if they cannot read enough to cast an intelligent vote. I would apply this rule to all, white or colored. I find that in Mrs. Sanders' own account of her trip with her father to Florida and some of her experiences there, she has failed to mention the fact that in those early days, when she taught at Mangonius School, there was a family by the name of Rowley that had come in from Hudson, New York, to make their home in Florida, she did not explain that this woman was one of her closest friends in those very earliest days. I will attempt to get something about the family and the father of the family from another article that I had written and insert that at this story about the husband and father of the family of the Rowleys was written by me and was printed on that in the Tampa Tribune Sunday paper under the heading, "The Colonel wrote about Lake Worth in the Melbourne paper." As you know, most of the men who are good storytellers eventually are called a captain or a colonel or something of that kind. And George S. Rowley was finally acquired that title because of the fact that in the early days when he first came as a resident to West Palm Beach, the nearest newspaper that was being printed at that time was at Melbourne, Florida, and was being printed by a young man by the name of Guy Metcalf, and who later moved that paper to Juneau, the then county seat of Dade County, and later to West Palm Beach, and eventually it became known not as the Tropical Sun, which was the Metcalf name of the paper, but as a West Palm Beach Post and Times. I will read what I had written about it because it's a good deal of an idea of what I had gotten about the man during the time I knew him. And we call him Colonel Rowley, all right. And here's what the newspaper heading then goes on to say in the Tampa Tribune. Ray Sanders of Inverness writes an interesting story of Colonel George S. Rowley, one of his first acquaintances, when he arrived in Lake Worth in August 1890. He speaks of the colonel as a freelance reporter, pioneer of the Gold Coast, adventurer in risky jobs, gentleman, lovable, hater of shams, and a firm believer in the future of Florida. Here's the quotation of my article. Colonel Raleigh was one of the first men I met when I arrived in Lake Worth August 16, 1890. He had been a resident there since 1884. Prior to that time, he had been instrumental in building a telegraph line for the United States government from Coffeyville, Kansas to Fort Worth, Texas, through the heart of the Indian Territory, or No Man's Land as it was then known. Sometime later, about 1873, he was again sent by the government to run a telegraph line from Titusville to Jupiter Lighthouse along the west side of Indian River. This enterprise brought him into brief contact with Lake Worth, where coconut palm trees grew and where it seemed as near paradise as a man could possibly get. He was a native of Hudson, New York, and spent his youth there, learned to handle the Morse code as a telegrapher, and as such had absorbed much of the lingo and jargon of the reporters of that day. He was married young to a Miss Nettie Moore, and had to leave his family for the aforementioned wire jobs, but finally determined to move to Florida in the early 80s. Those early years were no paradise, as by the time the trip from Hudson, New York was completed, there were very little funds left for living expenses. With full belief in the future, like Micawber, that something would turn up, he took up a homestead on the west side of the lake in what is called Northwood today as a part of the present West Palm Beach. Fish were plentiful. Deer were in the flatwoods to the west. Some tomato growers were just beginning extensive plantings and needed occasional help. With two nearly grown sons and himself, it was no great matter to feed and clothe his brood. The nearest newspaper, the Tropical Sun, was being printed at Melbourne, some 100 miles north. Even at that early date, the nose for news again blossomed in the colonel's mind, and he began sending weekly letters of the comings and goings and general happenings to the editor of the Sun. During the 6 years preceding my arrival in 1890, those notes had intrigued many visitors to the then new Indian River section, and the next year led them to try the trip to Jupiter, cross to Lake Worth, either by hack over the Palmetto routes or brave the seasickness by boat out of Jupiter Inlet, 10 miles on the ocean to Lake Worth Inlet. These hardy adventurers drew more tourists each year, and the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West Railway put a steamer route from Titusville to Jupiter for winter runs and later all-year trips because of the increasing loads of pineapples that were being grown. All this boom-like activity drew the paper Tropical Sun in Melbourne as a magnet draws iron filings. The new courthouse was located at Juneau, the extreme north end of Lake Worth, and for a short time Guy Metcalf located his paper there. The Tropical Sun was for several years the only paper in all of Old County. Later, when Henry M. Flagler started building his East Coast Railway towards the Lake Worth section, another paper, the Times, was started by the Dean brothers, Bobo and Joel. After the Royal Pensiano was finished and the Flagler Road was started on towards Miami, Bobo Dean went along and started the Miami Herald. During these years, Colonel Raleigh was the most persistent newspaper man as far as pushing the wonders of the Lake Worth section of the lower East Coast. Yet he also delighted in showing some northermen where the bass were to be found, or going with dog and gun for the fast-vanishing deer that were retreating further west each season. There was a firm friendship between the colonel and Lake Wilson, an old-fashioned shoemaker who bought his own leather and made your shoes to order as in olden days. Lake had made a pact with the Brighton Seminoles to use as much of their finely tanned deer hides as he could in his business. the Indians found him such a square shooter that they invited him to their green corn dance. Lake had discussed the matter with Colonel Rowley, and after lengthy negotiations with the Indians, it was decided to hold the green corn dance in West Palm Beach with the Indians themselves as the chief actors. I feel quite safe in saying that it was largely owing to the bulldog spirit of the colonel that the first pageant was pulled off, and that the rest of the town were glad to follow his lead. It seems a great pity that this Indian festival has, with the death of the two mainsprings, Colonel George S. and Lake Wilson, fallen into innocuous desuetude, to quote President W.H. Taft of the long ago. Tropical sun was absorbed in the Palm Beach post. Rowley, Metcalf, and Wilson have gone west years ago. As I have already mentioned, the town of Juneau, as the county seat of Dade County in the early days, I am reminded of an article that I had written regarding the lynching of the only person that I knew anything about in old Dade County in those days and times. I had written about it, the story, as much as I could gather as to how and what had happened from all the sources possible, and of course, as usually in that sort of a case, those who were engaged in the lynching party have tried to keep themselves unknown, and as I myself did not know a thing about it until after I was told the story later, but it happened during the time while I was living on Lake Worth at that. I have done the best I could in trying to tell the story as near as I could gather from all sources, any source whatsoever, what had happened and why. And it is headed, was in the Tampa Sunday Tribune, was printed in the Sunday Tribune, June the 15th, 1958, and is headed, "They Killed the Jailer and They Hanged Sam." The lynching of Sam Lewis. This is a quotation of my article at the present time. Railroad building into any new country has always been accompanied by boom towns and an invasion by the riffraff of gamblers, bootleggers, prostitutes, and a lawlessness of every description. The coming of Henry M. Flagler's railroad to the Lake Worth section, and as it is now known, the Gold Coast of the Palm Beaches, was no exception to this general rule. It should be remembered that the building of the Royal Poinciana Hotel was carried on while the railroad was being built from St. Augustine to the beaches. As Dade County was dry, there was a year or two that the bootlegger had a harvest, as no open saloon was legal until a county vote could be taken. There were several hundreds of men employed in the construction of the big hotel. A near army of common labor was needed to handle the material, and many others, seeing a good chance of establishing a business of their own in a fast-growing town, were crowding in and had to be supplied with homes, rooms, boarding houses, and so forth. Among the lawless group was a man named Sam Lewis. He trained with a group of gamblers, bootleggers, and hold-up men who were busily skimming the cream from every payroll as well as from the drinkers. To say the least, the rather placid, humdrum lawmen of the time had no experience with such a sudden overflow of law breaking, and as a consequence, there were many petty crimes that never were prosecuted. When the big building boom of the road and the hotel was over, and there was talk of building the road on to Miami, the community was startled by the shooting of a Negro man while he was working on a seawall directly in front of the rooming house where Sam Lewis had an upstairs room. Investigations showed that a hole had been cut in the window screen and a Winchester rifle poked through the hole, as Sam Lewis had commandeered a sloop belonging to Hiscox and was known to have a Winchester with him, and as the last seen of the Hiscox sloop was outside the 3-mile limit said to be sailing for Bimini, no attempt was made at the time for his arrest. From this point on to the lynching, there are 2 separate stories told. Ted Smallwood from the Thousand Islands on the west coast was a frequent visitor to the Lemon City settlement on Biscayne Bay, and he thought Lewis was being put on by Deputy Sheriff Highsmith and his nephew, Davis. Also, that at the lynching, a posse of Lemon City men were the ones that went to the county seat at Juneau and did the shooting and hanging. The story usually told on Lake Worth does not match up a bit like that. First off, when the news reached the sheriff that Lewis had made Hiscox bring him back to Lemon City on Biscayne Bay, Highsmith was duly deputized to go to Lemon City and arrest him for the murder of the Negro. Lewis was acting as bartender for 2 of his former cronies at the Palm Beach days, and when Highsmith showed up to arrest him, Lewis threw his Winchester on the deputy and told him to get down on his knees with his hands in the air. Highsmith was a Texan, and that went hard with him, but as he was unarmed, but he did as ordered and taunted Lewis that he did not dare shoot an unarmed man. Lewis's answer was to pull the trigger, killing Highsmith on the spot. Then he turned his gun on Lewis, who was also kneeling by his uncle, and asked him what he was going to do about it. Davis mumbled something, and Lewis shot him. Lewis again hid out. Some said he again went to Bimini. Others said he was hidden by some of his friends in Lemon City. He was at length discovered, and he sent word that if a certain man would come for him, he would surrender. However, when this man came for him, there was some disagreement, and the 3rd man was wounded so badly that he died. This pulled the trigger, and in the final melee, Lewis had a broken leg before he finally gave up. Lewis was taken to Juneau, some 75 miles north of Miami, and put in jail. Herman Kaiser was the jailer and lived in a small house immediately behind the jail with his wife. The public in general heaved a sigh of relief and waited for a circuit court to have him tried and legally hanged. It has been said that Highsmith was a Mason and had visited Harmonia Lodge in Juneau before he was sent to arrest Lewis. It was also known that the widow of the 4th man who was murdered had relatives and friends living on Biscayne Bay. Probably none of the men who lynched Lewis are alive today. I heard scraps of talk that made it certain in my mind that this trip was very carefully planned, that the steamer Lake Worth was secretly taken from U.D. Hendrickson's wharf, was run without lights to Hypoluxo and back to Juneau about midnight, that in the ruckus that occurred in breaking into the jail, Jailer Kaiser was shot and instantly killed. Lewis was taken to a telegraph pole in front of the courthouse and hanged. Later, his body was riddled with bullets. The steamer made a second round trip of the lake and was lying innocently at her old wharf the next morning. It was later rumored that the lawless gang that Lewis had run with so long was planning a jail delivery for him, which would have been almost as easy of accomplishment as the lynching had been. I feel sure this lynching was more or less condoned by the general public, as it served notice that murderers would get their just desserts. At any rate, the men who were subsequently elected in Dade County as sheriffs were of a pretty stern breed, and that lawless element began to hunt greener pastures elsewhere. As an added note, I wish to say that I have waited until all the engineers and pilots who were on Lake Worth at the time of the lynching, who could have operated the steamer Lake Worth, have passed on, and this story will not embarrass them as having been on that boat ride. Further, I did not earn my ticket as a marine engineer for 2 years after it all happened. Your conjecture as to where that group of men came from is as good as mine. Of one thing I am very sure, none of them are living today, so the real truth about it is completely lost unless someone's conscience caused him to leave a written confession somewhere. I noticed that the #1 monaural of this tape, which would be 1/4 of what can be put on the entire tape, is running along pretty well, and as there is a great deal of this written material that has been printed of my recollections, which perhaps would be better for me to read than not. I will not comment too much in between, but I'm picking some of them up at random as I had written them at the time, and you can place them as you please in your mind as some of the things of the days of those that happened, of the things that happened in those days. I note one here that was printed on December the 29th, 1957, in the Tampa Tribune, about the nearest druggist that we had in those early days. And I'll proceed to read it at once. In picking up the thread of Lake Worth's early history, there is more to be said of the 3 sons of Mrs. Potter. The doctor was the eldest and was called on to serve the whole community from Jupiter Light to the extreme south end of Lake Worth, a narrow strip some 40 miles long and a little over a mile wide. His means of travel was a sailboat or a rowboat, and if these failed, he walked the beach with his black bag in his hand. There was no pharmacist nearer than Titusville, 150 miles north, so he compounded his own medicine as needed from a rather scanty store of drugs that he kept on hand. Dr. Richard Potter surely deserved to be counted as one of the noted family doctors of his day. The second son, George Potter, was the only surveyor we knew until after Flagler's Railway started the town of West Palm Beach. He had a small schooner fitted up for living aboard, so that wherever he was called, he anchored his schooner, the Pelican, as near the job as possible, and returned to it for meals and the night's lodging, as well as to finish maps of the surveys. When the Flagler boom started at West Palm Beach, Franklin Sheen and others took over the surveying, and George went into partnership with the carpenter builder George W. Lanehart in a lumber yard and General Builders Supplies. Both the partners have been gone several years, but the company name still carries on. The third brother was still a stripling when I first knew him, but Ben Potter soon grew into the ways and work of those days, acquired a sharply rigged sailboat, and did a good business carrying freight to and from Celestial Railway at Juneau, especially the early tomatoes that were beginning to be in great demand during the cold New York winter months. Both George and Ben were happily married, but our beloved doctor traveled the lone road of a bachelor, and I fancy this fact made him a real second love for every woman of those early days. This does not mean that the Potter family was the only group that made history. My thoughts run down to the south end of the lake, to Hypoluxo Island. Captain Pierce, his son Charlie, and their mother had settled on this island early in the 1880s. The first white girl born in Dade County was their daughter Lily. This island post office was the place where the barefoot mailman took the mail sack on his shoulders and started down the beach to Lemon City and old Fort Dallas of the Seminole War days to the post office on Brickell's Point, and led to the polished up yarn of the book by that name, as well as the movie that was made. Very soon after I arrived in 1890, there were two other families who settled on the west side of the lake across from Hypoluxo Island. I think the Bradley family was there first, but it was only a very short time until the Lyman family started a store. The father in the Bradley family was one of the first neighborhood writers for the paper Tropical Sun that was first published in Melbourne in Brevard County and moved to Juneau in Dade County at a very early date. Bradley always signed his effusions OMB, meaning Old Man Bradley. His two sons were musicians, and with Charlie Pierce of Hypoluxo Island and one of the ladies in that of the Lyman families who played a parlor organ, formed the orchestral nucleus of what afterwards grew into the Lake Worth Band and was the forerunner of West Palm Beach's $1 Million Band of the early 1910 days. Guy Bradley played violin, Mark Bradley cello, Charles Pierce cornet, George Lyman trombone, and W.H. Sanders piano and bass viol. The younger Bradley, Guy, was afterwards a game warden at Cape Florida, where he was shot and killed by one of the plume bird hunters while he was trying to stop the slaughter of the egrets and roseate spoonbill flamingos. In this tragic way, our East Coast history links up with the roughneck hunters of the lower Gulf Coast. Miss Lily Pierce afterwards married Fred Vos, a young marine engineer from Bath, Maine, who had already spent 2 winters on Hendrickson's steamer Lake Worth. It was the same steamer and engineer that I got to know so well while I was purser on that boat 2 winters myself. Fred was the oldest living pioneer in 1893. When I was at Jupiter last Thanksgiving, pioneer of 1893. When I was at Jupiter last Thanksgiving Day, it was with deep regret that I later learned he had passed on at the ripe age of 92. I should perhaps be a bit more diligent with my recollections, as, if I am not totally too badly mistaken, since Fred has answered the final roll call, I am now at the head of the class. Just do not have a further flow of language right now, but the story is at least well started. The naphtha gas launches of the early days of Lake Worth and the Palm Beaches. I find that this article was written and published in the Tampa Tribune of March the 20th, 1958. Pioneer naphtha engines is the heading. Quotation. Memory plays queer tricks at times. I have been reminded of early experiences with the steam and gas engines that I have operated or owned since the day when I landed on Lake Worth in 1890. The first steam locomotive that I saw was in Clay County, Kansas. It was a very modest affair on the Junction City and Fort Kearny Railway that ran up Republican River Valley when I was about 6 years old. From that day to the present moment, the steam engine, in all its manifold forms and sizes, has held a very prominent place in my affections. Up to the late 80s, I had never heard of an internal combustion engine, and only then as a machine that produced power only where coal gas could be used, and over in Europe, where some crack-brained fools were trying to beat good old steam. On Lake Worth, there were several small boats equipped with steam used for fishing or pleasure parties, and one real passenger steamer that was making regular passenger and freight trips during the tourist season. Besides this, there was the naphtha launch, owned by Van Barton, that, as its name implies, was operated by naphtha, as it was then called, but which would today be called a gasoline launch. This was in reality just a three-cylinder steam engine that used the gasoline gas instead of the water and steam. The crankshaft had the pins set 120 degrees apart, used the gas on the top of the pistons only, had a coiled copper pipe boiler, used the gasoline as a fuel to boil the gasoline in the boiler, and usually worked at a gauge pressure of 90 pounds per square inch. The valve gear was a rotary that could be easily reversed by a convenient hand wheel so that handling of the boat when making landings was possible. The exhaust gas from the engine was piped into a condenser that lay on each side of the keel and was condensed back into the original gasoline and used over and over. The only fuel consumption was that which was needed to make steam in the water. The second winter I lived in Florida, a Captain Dimmick had also gotten one of these naphtha launches and hired me to operate it as a party fishing boat for the tourists who were guests at the Coconut Grove Hotel, which he owned and operated during the winter season. I must say that for type of engine, they fairly drank the gasoline to keep the boiler hot, and as soon as the real internal combustion engine had proved its worth and the cheapness of its power as compared to the naphtha type, the latter was soon put out of business. For some 3 years, 1890 to 94, there were no gas engines as we know them today that came as far south as Lake Worth, although the Scientific American had been printing articles about Dr. Otto's four-stroke cycle gas engine and its successive failures, its success as a rival of the steam engine. Also, some success had been made in building a more or less successful ignition system with electric sparks using a clumsy wet battery and a low voltage induction coil, which produced a blazing arc whenever the current from the batteries was broken at any point in a completed circuit through the induction coil. By 1893, there was a two-stroke cycle gas engine that was making quite a noise in the world, and it was only a question of time until some enterprising yachtsman had one of these installed in small boats to drive an outboard propeller directly connected to the engine shaft put out through the stern of the boat below the water line, aping the great steam ocean liners. The outboard engine of today is really a very late invention. Dr. Otto's engine had succeeded in using a platinum tube projecting from the combustion chamber above the pistons, but open to that space and closed at the other end. And this tip end was heated by a small gasoline jet to incandescence. When the fresh air and gasoline gas were compressed, some of this mixture was forced into this platinum tube at about the end of the compression stroke and would be ignited by the heated platinum. This obviated most of the ignition troubles that usually went with the early electric apparatus. When Flagler built his railroad as far south as West Palm Beach, there was a regular spate of newcomers who bought homes, brought power boats of every type of power, from storage battery electric to the then new Daimlers that were also using the platinum tube with gas jet. The gay 90s were truly a time of experimenting with engines, fuels, ignition systems, and the various mechanisms that could be used to reverse the propellers to make safe and easy landing of the boats. In this mass of experimentation, there was bound to be many ludicrous mishaps, and some real fine inventions were actually made by mistake. Today, the advance and retarding of the ignition point is almost wholly automatic. In those days, spark advance or retardation was unknown. It was a definite fact that broken arms, fingers, or wrists were certain if the ignition was started before the full stroke of the piston had not been completed. One youngster that I knew, for some reason, had the cylinder head taken off of the one-cylinder, two-stroke cycle boat engine he owned. In replacing the head of the slightly changed top guide of the rod that triggered the battery ignition. When he attempted to start the engine, he found the spark was made so soon that the engine tried to run backwards. But when it came up on the compression stroke, as he reversed, the jigger rod again tripped the ignition too soon, and there he was watching that engine rock itself back and forth with no complete turnover in either direction. He sat there watching it, began to reason with himself as to the cause. Finally, the idea struck him that all the trouble was in the jigger rod, so while that engine was still having its own hijinks, he picked up a hammer and hit a tap on the side of the guide. The guide was shifted enough to give a very late spark, and immediately that engine started turning over, but at a very slow rate. The final result was that real spark advance had been discovered. That youngster became noted for safely starting his engine with a hammer and getting remarkable speed later by again beating up his engine with a hammer. By the late 90s, there had been a vast variety of gas engines installed in not only boats but the automobile and big scow-like houseboats that were coming south for the winter in ever-increasing numbers. For some time, the single-cylinder, two-stroke, slow-turning engines were in the ascendancy. Multiple-cylinder machines seemed to just multiply the worries and confusion of the operators until most of the ignition and carburation bugs had been worked out and the starter storage battery was made a success. I hesitate to try to catalog the many makes and various styles and rated powers of the many boats and later traction engines that I have either owned, operated, repaired, or taught others how to run and care for since those early days. So far, I have not actually operated a multi-cylinder diesel or an airplane, but I still think I must have been born 30 years too soon as far as my desire to see a genuine atomic engine do its wonderful work. Yet in my lifetime, I have been permitted to see and understand some of the staggering developments of this technico-mechanical age. And I say with Samuel F. B. Morse's first telegraph message, what God hath wrought. I have found among my clippings one that came from a paper printed at Fort Pierce up on Indian River that is relates the story that my own sister made of her early teaching when she first came into that southern country. And it is headed by Mrs. Susan Sanders Du Bois, Early School Teaching in Florida. I would like to relate a little of my experiences as a school teacher way back in 1897. My father and married brother were in Florida before my sister and myself came down in the summer of 1897. There were 5 men to every woman, and school teachers were very scarce. The teacher's examination for that year had been held before I arrived, so they sent me to Titusville to take the examination there. Dade County at that time ran up half the state. I was assigned to a little school just started out in the woods west of Stewart. I arrived in Stewart about 11 a.m. on a Saturday. School was to start on Monday. There was a store and post office combined run by one of the Kitching brothers. I inquired there if anyone from Leesville, as it was then called, was in to meet me. They said 2 children had walked in, so after rounding them up, we started out. It was a rainy fall and the woods were full of water. After walking down the railroad track for a mile or more, we struck out through the woods. It was cloudy and overcast, and in about 2 hours we were back at the railroad again. We started out again, but by skirting the big ponds, we found ourselves once more back at the tracks. So we looked for the next blazed tree before we would go any further. We waded right through the big ponds. We had only a pear and a peach to eat all day, which I gave to the children. One was a boy of 8 and the other a girl of 12. The boy got wet and cold and began to cry, so I gave him my raincoat and plodded on through the ponds. Then they began to tell me the ponds were full of alligators and cottonmouth moccasins, so you might know how terribly frightened I was, but on we went. It became dark, so we squatted down by a big pine tree and waited. About 10 p.m. we saw a light. They had sent out a search party for the children. We were pretty glad to see them. They took us home, fed us, and gave me dry clothes, as my trunk was still at the steward. The woman of the house was about my build, but a foot shorter. The mother and the daughter had only 1 pair of shoes between them. The father and the boys did not have any. The father did have a pair of bedroom slippers, which he loaned me. The mother got some clothes out of a trunk, a brown merino dress with a train. I think she said it was her wedding dress. The next day I burst out laughing, and I suppose they thought I was going crazy until I explained how I happened to look down and noticed the big number 10 slippers. The dress just reached my knees. We wore them ankle length in those days, and a little train behind just grazed the floor. I did cut a funny figure, but after a big laugh, the ice was broken, and we soon became acquainted. But to go back to the night before, when it came time to go to bed, they all lived in the one big room, a bed in every corner, and one between on the long side of the room. There were 4 or 5 boys in the family, besides 2 young men boarders. I was assigned to sleep with a 12-year-old daughter. I said kind of hesitatingly, "Isn't there going to be any privacy for me to retire?" So they went to the boat, got the sail, and draped it around my bed. The bed was a homemade affair with a 2x4 down the middle and barrel staves nailed to it from each side, and the mattress was filled with shredded saw palmetto leaves. The house, by the way, was also thatched side and roof with palmetto leaves. A washed-out fertilizer sack was tacked over each window opening. The house had a wood floor, and there was a log homemade dining table with backless benches, the same length on each side. The cooking was done in a separate shack. The regular bill of fare was unsalted oatmeal gruel, fried salt pork, baked powder biscuits, or baking powder biscuits for breakfast, and the bacon grease to go on them. For dinner and supper we had black-eyed peas, sweet potatoes, and grits. The schoolhouse was an 8-by-12-foot palmetto shack with no floor and no desk for me but a box to sit on. The children sat on a long backless bench with a continuous slanting board in front to prop their book against. Then there was a desk and bench down each side of the room and a place for me to walk up and down in the center. When it rained, the roof leaked so badly I had to put up my umbrella. I taught children, just beginners, to some almost as I was, for the princely sum of $40 per month. My board and washing was $10 a month. There was an old batch who walked out from Stewart on Sunday. It was 8 miles through the woods and 12 miles by the river. He brought 1 big horse banana for every one of the Lee's family and 2 for me. There was a young man who worked in the store the steward who rode out on his horse occasionally. One time he brought out a shoebox of candy when I wasn't there. They informed me half was for the 12-year-old girl. I've always wondered if that part was so. Anyway, we went into the bedroom to divide it. At that time they had built a little framework around the bed and tacked fertilizer sacks on it. After a while we heard a noise, and looking up we saw her 3 small brothers hanging from the rafters like monkeys watching us. The teacher at Jupiter had been having trouble with the trustees, and to punish her, they sent her out to the little school I was teaching and sent me into the Jupiter school after Christmas. Here I met my future husband, but that's another story. Susan M. Du Bois. I find that I had written something about the early days when the Ponciana Hotel was first in operation. And as that goes back to the very beginnings of things, I think I will read that in right now. And it's putting you in time to turn this tape over anyway. The Royal Ponciana guests one time rode bicycles. Primitive modes of travel. I have been much interested in the many stories of the horse and buggy days in Florida as to the very primitive means of transportation that so many of them enjoy, and with a question mark behind it. Looking back to my first acquaintance with the Gold Coast and our methods of getting from here to there was mainly by boats, schooners, sloops, single stickers, sailboats, the humble rowboat of every type, and 2 small steamboats of very early vintage. There was the alternative of walking the ocean beach or the shores of Lake Worth. It is true there was a fair-sized steamer named the Lake Worth that was used only during the tourist season to carry them from the Celestial Railway at Juneau, the north end of Lake Worth, to the 2 hotels of that time, both on the east side of the lake, and from them back to Juneau when they started north again. The use of the boats of any sort was so common that the so-called trail along the east side of the lake had not even been cleared as a walking path for a couple of years after my arrival in 1890. However, after H.M. Flagler had made his first visit to that part of the state, a few hardy souls made a big stir, and that lakeside trail was cleared from Cragen's show place to the home of George W. Lanehart. The safety bicycle was just coming into vogue at that time all over the United States, and a few enterprising folks invested in the horseless thingamajigs, and of course the rest of us soon fell in line. With Flagler's Railroad and huge hotels in prospect, the county commissioners felt called upon to begin road building both north and south of the new town of West Palm Beach. As this narrow road was beginning to lengthen out, there was a grand influx of investors on the west side of the lake also, and they in turn cleared a lakeshore trail for bicycles as had been done on the east side of the lake. The first year the Royal Ponciana Hotel was opened, large numbers of bicycles were shipped in for the use of hotel guests. By 1895, the wheelchairs appeared in large numbers, and the east trail was widened enough for their passage. The wheelchair was wide enough for 2 people to ride very comfortably, side by side. The power was supplied through a 3rd wheel at the back, ridden by a husky Negro. A trip north to Cragen's place or to the ostrich farm and banyan tree to the south was a must for the tourists, as well as a trip to the ocean beach, the breakers, or the winter homes of friends. Both of these trails were first made with the idea of being wide enough for single bikes to pass without trouble. When the wheelchairs came along, there were still many places where the original jungle was undisturbed. In such spots, turnouts were cut where the nearest chair was to await the passing of the other chair, as is done on narrow mountain roads with cars at the present time. During the years that Flagler was spending so much money on his vast holdings in and near the beaches, the internal combustion engine was just beginning to be put into boats, and there was a rapidly increasing number of row or sailboats that were converted into power boats with a vast lot of grief, with wet batteries, magnetos, and small dynamos being utilized for ignition purposes, with worlds of grief for all the beginners. The automobiles that soon followed had one advantage with the cars. When the engine stopped, a chap could get out and get under, but with a boat, that method did not work very well. The usual answer was to take a pole and pole the boat to the nearest dock and walk the rest of the way. I should mention here that Flagler had a fleet of electric boats for 2 or 3 years at the Royal Ponciana docks for the convenience of his hotel guests, as all the electric current that was used in the hotels was what is known as DC, direct current. The storage batteries on the electric boats could be recharged overnight and be ready for service the next day. Apparently there were enough drawbacks to the maintenance of this type of boat that when the Miami boom started in the late 90s, the electric boats were a thing of the past as far as Lake Worth was concerned. The streets of West Palm Beach were first paved with oyster shell from the huge mounds that were still in evidence wherever oysters had flourished in ages past. Perhaps we were much happier in those days and had not been brainwashed by all the new ideas like the airplane, the split atom, and the Russian type communism as we are today, with all the timid souls in the blue funk because of fallout or some other ulcer-producing set of worries. I think there is time for one more article to be read in here, and it is headed Fort Myers to Miami in 30 strenuous days, and refers to the trip that Henry B. Plant made with some of his men attempting to get into Miami before Flagler did with his railroad. The Plant started from 10.